I have chosen the title, The Value of Design, because I think it is important that we understand design in its broadest sense, but also in its narrow sense, that is the value of design. So I'm going to talk about it in its narrow sense, the financial value of design. Next slide, please. There will be some people in the audience who, the one before that, I think, who may remember this statement. Urban design needs to be inclusive rather than exclusive of sponsors and users' interests and concerns. It needs to use language that sponsors and users understand. I mean the language of money and the marketplace. We need to promote the idea that quality sells. And, you know, people of a certain age will remember John Gummer. And they'll also recall, as was mentioned earlier, that design and planning, design seems to come into planning and disappear from planning at various stages. There was a point when there were many appeal decisions taken where they said it's not the job of the planner to take decisions on design. And here we are full circle where Pillar 3 of the planning reform white paper is almost exclusively about building beautiful places, which is about design. Next slide, please. In the next slide, I'm seizing here on the last two words of John Gummer's statement, which is quality sells. And this is very important in all kinds of ways. And those of you familiar with these exemplar developments will be able to recognize these straight off. Upton, Northamptonshire was referred to already. Hampton in Peterborough is there, the middle one. And on the right, you've got Kings Hill in Kent. And down at the bottom, you've got Accordia, Cambridge. And on the right, you've got Mulhall, Harlow. Now, this is the result of a piece of work we did to try and identify the link between creating great places and enhancing financial value. And of course, we did conclude that if you develop good places and if you create them to exemplar standards, you will achieve higher values. Now, that's a very important thing to understand in terms of incentivizing a largely private developer market to actually do this kind of work and to build to these standards. So when Helen showed those two slides of really good quality looking developments contrasted with really poor quality developments coming out of the planning system, you began to wonder, well, what has been the shortcoming here? Because it's the same planning system. So is it an implementation problem? Is it an enforcement problem? Is it a skills problem? But these are all very valid questions to ask. You will also note in this slide that the top three images are of very traditional type housing. The bottom two are from a different sort of menu of design options. In fact, the one on the left is an RIBA award-winning scheme, and the one on the right is an RIBA proposed scheme in Mulhall in Harlow. So all of these schemes have been based on design and development, based on design codes or design policies or design guides, however we describe these. And, you know, we're already in some kind of debate about what the terminology for these is and what their status is within the planning system. Next slide, please. So we now begin to sort of ask the question about, you know, what's the outcome of these? We do have a lot of process built into our systems, but the question is, what's the outcome and what are we trying to achieve? And that question that I'm raising, and that was already raised, about how do we have such varying results coming out of the same system? And so my kind of aspiration for this is that we would lift the average standard of development. So, and I attribute this, I term this as creating good normative architecture. Now, in the architecture profession, normative architecture is pretty dull stuff, mainly. So that should be an aspiration, probably is a bit weak. Nevertheless, if we succeeded in providing everybody with really well-designed places, then in the form which is, and I'll use the term again, normative, but what does it mean? Is it what the planner thinks is normative? What the banker thinks is normative? What the developer thinks, or the purchaser? And these are very important. And I'll pick out the banker for a start, because if you go back to Accordi at Cambridge, I remember having a chat with the developer of the period who said that at some point in the negotiations for the banking loans, the bank said, "You must be crazy. Nobody would ever buy anything like that. How would you be, building houses without gardens? That's radically different than anybody would ever imagine would be able to sell." Now, the result of that is that the bankers skimmed 15% off the gross development value to reduce their risk. So you can see how this is straight away connected into how we fund development. And that's very important. And I'll show you a slide at the end, which will emphasize the importance of that. Now, that banker would have been advised by a development surveyor like me, who would say, "I've turned up there. I've never seen a house without a garden." And if we're going to promote houses, they need to have gardens. What I'm talking about here is whether or not these design codes that we are going to be producing, whether they are based on inflexible ideas about what living is. And there's hardly anybody at the moment who thinks that without innovation in how we design and build, we cannot address climate change. So there are very interesting tensions between the idea of having greater certainty to assure people of what is going to be built. And that's a big part of the planning system at the moment. And I have to say, in our submissions to government, we have advocated greater certainty. Because, there is a sense in communities that they make a plan over a 15-year period and they still have no idea what's going to turn up. And likewise, for developers who work with the planning system, they're unclear about what is required. So a move to more certainty is probably a good step. Nevertheless, if it means that we paralyze everything in order to be certain, that is a problem, in my view. Which takes us into tricky territory like taste, which is personal, and style, which is, it could be from a particular period, or a particular period where an architectural orthodoxy applied. When I studied planning many years ago, it was still, the modern movement was still in full spate. And in fact, when I worked as a planner, postmodernism was all the rage, and it was great because architects designed buildings that actually were like Georgian buildings in Dublin that I was very familiar with. and so we go through all of these styles and tastes, but what we really are down to is design, quality design, and I'm saying it transcends these personal tastes and styles. Now, that judgment about design has typically been an architectural judgment, but you find that in the current scheme of policy, architects have been kind of pushed to one side. And I wonder who then is going to be the arbiter in this case. Next slide, please. I put this up partly in a mood of lightness, but also because it's a personal experience. And I'm presenting it here as the alternative agent's details. It's a very desirable residence in a sought-after location. And it's a 3-bedroom terraced house, 120 square meters over 3 floors, so it's pretty decent size. It's a waterfront setting. But here it begins to sort of fall apart a bit. Access through a supermarket car park. It's not a great selling point, is it? If it looks like a bit of a caravan on end, well, you wouldn't go for that either. And it's got a warehouse type sliding door on one side and corrugated metal sheeting on the other. Now, here's the interesting thing. I got an instruction from a bank to value this property many years ago. So you can imagine when I turned up and saw this, it wasn't the first time I saw it. I live in the area, actually. And it was not surprising at all when I saw it. But I said to myself, my God, how am I going to value this? How am I going to place a value on this? Next slide, please. This is what I was being asked to value, one of these dwellings. Some of you who know your architectural history will recognize it as a piece of work by Nicholas Grimshaw. It's part of high-tech modernism, very well designed, in a particular style. Well, what's the market for this? And that's a very critical thing when you are dealing with design. And very often, we as surveyors are criticized by architects because they say to us, you don't value our architecture. And my response is quite straightforward. You're absolutely right. We don't value your architecture. We assess what the market is prepared to pay for buildings which have architectural qualities associated with it. That's quite a different thing. It's not an architectural criticism we are doing. We are assessing whether or not in the market there is a demand for such a building. And the question that we have to satisfy ourselves, because the bank will sue us if we say, listen, there's a market for this at 700,000 and the borrower decides they can't pay any more and they sell it into the market at 500,000 because we've misunderstood whether or not there's demand for such a building at the price point of 700,000. These are very important considerations to take into account. Now, there may be a market at 700,000, but it might be very thin. Or if there is a recession, some of these buildings with unique character don't hold their value as well as the average. So this is where I come back to good normative architecture. And these are all very important things to consider when it comes to the interrelationship between Pillar 2 in the planning reform and Pillar 3, which deals with developer contributions and viability. That's not to say, next slide please, that this building here, which mightn't be to everybody's taste externally, doesn't provide amazingly good quality accommodation internally. And those design guides that we're talking about at the moment don't seem to say very much about the internal qualities of the spaces. And so, in a sense, we might be getting to a point where we're talking about exterior decoration rather than design in its fullest sense. I'm going to finish off with something, next slide, please, which you might be familiar with value engineering in the context of reducing costs. But here's value engineering in terms of increasing value. And this is not a trite question I'm going to raise. But the building on the left, this is Battersea Power Station. The building on the left is a design by Norman Foster's office. The building on the right is a design by Frank Gehry's office. Now the question, and this is not a trite question I've said, is would you pay more to be in Norman Foster's building looking out on Frank Gehry's, or would you prefer to be in Frank Gehry's looking out at Norman Foster's? Now, why is this significant? It's significant because the gross development value depends on these numbers. And the gross development value is critical to deciding whether or not there's affordable housing available in your viability assessment. So, this development as we're looking at it now, I'm not sure where that fits into this design guide coding. And this is a regular sort of London development, and many urban areas in the UK will have sites which would respond to these kinds of designs. And final slide. This is a survey which was taken in 2006. At the time, some of the case studies we did had been initiated, so we wanted to get a sense of what was in the public's mind, what was in the buyer's mind at the time they were thinking of buying those houses in those developments that we studied. But here is an interesting piece of research, and if there's anybody out there with a little bit of money who wants to have this research done, that would be really great. If we could have our current version of what this means, what is the residents' perception of what are the important factors in terms of housing and design, and if we look down at distinctive character, it's the second last on the list. So distinctive character doesn't really feature highly. And in fact, we have to go halfway down the slide to get appearance as coming into play. Now, it will be very interesting to see where the private garden and outside space has moved in the light of our experience up to now. I have nothing left to say other than thank you for listening. It's a very interesting area, and we're very interested in how this interfaces with market behaviors and how design can be used by developers and how they can be encouraged to create great places, design them well, and get the benefits both for their customers and for themselves, and deliver better places for us to live in. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think that was a really interesting and valuable kind of presentation, and I think it highlights that it is, well, there is another dimension to it again, which is possibly a little bit ignored in the current kind of discussion about the National Model Design Code. And it is the market, it is what people buy. And I mean, looking at your last chart, it is location. And I've seen a couple of people on the chat saying, well, as long as we have a housing crisis, we might never actually get out of the situation which we find ourselves in. And I think a very interesting point you made also is a criticism that is often targeted at codes in a very difficult conundrum, this certainty versus flexibility. And how do you kind of set the right level of prescriptiveness, leaving the room for innovation for the people who get it right, but controlling the quality for maybe the developers or the architects that don't get it right. I think that's a question maybe for later for the Q&A. So